I'm going to move on to the last part, which is the cards in opposition. President wishing to speak: Melissa Flournoy, Gwyneth O'Neill, Sarah Omagelo. And again, I'd like to just try to reiterate that we're on a 3-minute rule and we're close to having to go onto the floor.
Can I go before you?
Yeah, you can go before me.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon. I'm Ellie Schilling. I put in a red card as well.
I have it.
Okay. I'm an attorney in New Orleans that represents reproductive health care providers, and I have some other attorneys with me that are going to speak about some of the problems with this bill. But I want us to just sort of like level set here first that this is a homicide statute. What this bill does is to specifically amend the crime of homicide and the crime of criminal battery to enable the state to charge people, including the pregnant person, the pregnant mother, at any stage of gestation from the moment of fertilization without the need for implantation. Without the need for implantation. So we were here last week on a bill that would have affirmatively put protections in the law to say that the pregnant woman cannot be criminally charged in circumstances like this. And this committee failed to pass that bill. This is the exact opposite. This is saying that people can be charged with murder for any act that they take against their own pregnancy or anyone who assists them with it. So as I said, the other attorneys with me have more to explain about the implications of that. The last thing I'll say is that Representative Marino, to your point, of course, about that the bill also says that Supreme Court precedent can be disregarded. The explanation that you heard for that is basically that if a legislature doesn't agree with the Supreme Court precedent because the legislature decides that they think that the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution incorrectly, then a legislature doesn't have to follow that. There's no limiting principle on that. That could be applied with any Supreme Court precedent that any legislature, for whatever reason, thinks was wrongly decided. It would completely annihilate the Supremacy Clause, and there's a lot of other separation of powers issues in this bill.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Mojla. I wear a lot of hats. I've been here a couple of times, and actually today I have on my mama hat. I was blessed to conceive my beautiful, amazing, perfect daughter in November 2020, thanks to IVF, which actually would be criminalized by this bill. Because Louisiana doesn't have mandatory comprehensive sexual and reproductive health education, there's a lot I learned while undergoing fertility treatments. And so I'm going to give you all a quick education on IVF, and disclaimer, yes, I'm a lawyer. And I'm speaking from my personal experience with IVF. While preparing for IVF, I took many meds that were injected into my stomach or my backside, usually by my partner, who was profusely apologizing, but also professing love for me. And this helped my eggs grow. And when those follicles reached the right size, they were retrieved. And I had 23 follicles retrieved using a hollow needle inserted into my ovaries while I was under general anesthesia. And later that day, doctors fertilized those eggs, and some of them started to divide. This bill would give those cells personhood, such that anything that happens to them after could give rise to criminal prosecution. This criminalizes IVF. Not every embryo and not every fertilized egg can be brought to term. So they have to be tested. And so to test an embryo, cells are taken from it and tested. And this bill would allow my doctor and I to be prosecuted for battery for this standard medical practice. And then further, to preserve embryos for later use, they must be frozen. And that's a standard practice. And this could subject me and my doctor to prosecution for battery again. And embryos that were tested and not found to be viable are disposed and donated to science, or they're disposed of, and that is standard. And under this bill, doctors and patients like me could also be charged with murder or negligent homicide in a variety of standard medical practices with IVF. 2 months later, so I was very lucky, 2 months later, well, First, I had one embryo transferred into my uterus, and about a week later, I learned I wasn't pregnant. And that embryo wasn't viable. And that was a really, really hard day. It was complete with a lot of crying and a lot of second guessing. And under this bill, a person who has been trying very, very hard to get pregnant will find out that day, that on the day they're not pregnant, now they could be investigated and prosecuted. And so that's the criminalization of IVF in this bill. There are also a lot of interesting side effects that I had from being pregnant. And so my favorite one to talk about, which may make folks uncomfortable, but I'm happy to talk about it because it's real and we need more education about these things, is called lightning crotch. And what happens is a bunch of pains ricocheted through my vagina randomly throughout my pregnancy, which is totally normal. And another, and I heard the time, I'm going to be good for you, Representative Marino, I promise. Another was becoming very completely sure that legislators and the government have no business forcing people to give birth. Like people are not forced to donate blood or marrow or organs, even though people die every day from not having access to those things. And doctors and hospitals can't even take your organs after you die if you haven't previously said that they could. And forcing people to give birth to children means they have less power than a dead person. And so...
All right,
One second. All I'm going to say, 1 second, I promise, is that there are a long list of other bills that could be brought. And one of them that I would ask y'all to bring instead is comprehensive education to prevent unplanned pregnancies, because that's how you prevent abortions.
yes,
Happy to
ma'am.
answer questions.
There are no
Mr. Chairman,
questions.
members of the committee, my name is Gwyneth O'Neill. I'm here speaking today from the perspective of a lawyer and a predominantly criminal practitioner. As you said earlier, Representative Marino, that this bill undermines the very system that governs not just the state of Louisiana, but the system of government that exists in this country. And when you say the word abortion, people automatically choose a side. And so what you said resonated with me, Representative Marino, that take the substance out of this for just a moment and think about why this bill is reckless, why this bill is bad law, because it sets a precedent that could undermine our very system of government that we've decided we should have in the state of Louisiana and in the United States. This bill is blatantly unconstitutional in many different ways. So I'll just name a couple to begin. It undermines the concept of separation of powers by threatening impeachment or removal of judges who might oversee constitutional challenges, which, for anyone who didn't take 8th grade government, is the very purpose of the judiciary. The legislature has a job, an important job, but so do the courts. And it's not the legislature's prerogative to strip away the power of the courts on a topic by topic basis. That this bill is so preposterous in its attempt to dismantle our system is why we need multiple branches of government and checks and balances. This bill says that the United States Constitution and the U.S. are the supreme law of the land. That's written into this bill. But it contradicts that directly just a couple sentences down. Because if the Supremacy Clause is what it says, then you can't treat as void, which this bill seeks to do, specific federal statutes, regulations, treaties, orders, and court rulings. You just can't have it both ways. I invite you to take the principle behind this bill and to apply it in other contexts to see how dangerous it is. This is a committee that hears issues related to criminal justice. Well, tomorrow, can we decide that we should abolish the right to counsel for poor people who can't afford lawyers? Should we decide that same-sex marriage is not an enumerated right, but we have the power, even though the Constitution has recognized that that's a right, that tomorrow we can take that away too? The reality is that we cannot cherry pick which rights Louisiana intends to recognize and which we may forego. But this also represents a major departure, not just from regular constitutional law, but from established criminal law. It changes the language of personhood to begin at fertilization. There were a lot of people speaking in support who talked about this is protecting from the womb. No, this goes beyond that. This makes embryos people. And if embryos are people, outside of the womb, then embryos can be victims. And everything that my colleague here said is true. At best, this bill makes IVF unworkable, but reality is it makes it criminal because freezing an embryo would become a battery. The disposal of an embryo, even if incidental, would be a negligent homicide or potentially a murder. But this bill goes even further than that because it carves out,
please
very
wrap.
quickly,
Yeah, go ahead.
it carves out an exception. We've established, it's been long established law that justification is not a defense to murder. But this carves out an exception, which, to be honest with you, is worded so confusingly that even as a criminal practitioner, I'm not entirely clear what it's trying to do, but it seems clear that what it's trying to do is carve out an exception where no exception would exist under any other context. And so this bill is very problematic. It also presents ex post facto violation issues that are unconstitutional. And so it's a terrible law. It's a terrible policy, and it's a terrible precedent, even ignoring what the substance matter is. And so I urge you all to oppose this bill.
Thank you. We have one final card, which is President would like to speak in opposition, Melissa Forney, and we are going to do only 3 minutes. We are at 2:00, which is the time we go to the floor.
Some questions for you. Mr. Chairman, I'm Melissa Flournoy. I'm here today to ask you to defer House Bill 813. This bill has too many unintended consequences. I think the Supreme Court may be on the way to accomplishing the goal of overturning Roe v. Wade. But today I want to talk about the consequences for women and what this bill, I hope, unintentionally does. The personhood designation from fertilization will have consequences. The way this bill is written, it would outlaw many forms of birth control. As you know, the act of procreation requires a man and a woman in order to create a fertilized egg. Oftentimes we don't talk enough about male responsibility. And so I think there are lots of issues with this bill. But most of all, I think we need to take a deep breath and see that this bill would add language that would make most forms of birth control illegal. One of my concerns is that it'll add language that essentially would say, or that I would say, that no man should have unprotected sex with a woman unless that woman has consented to become pregnant and carry his child. If we allow or outlaw contraception, and let's talk about this from a legal perspective. Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965 made it legal for married couples to use contraception. Eisenstadt v. Baird in 1972 made it legal for unmarried couples to use birth control pills. Birth control pills are intended to prevent women from getting pregnant by delaying ovulation. IUDs, which are a common birth control method, which stands for intrauterine device, discourages a fertilized egg from implanting and growing and becoming a fetus. We've passed legislation in this legislature around emergency contraception for women who've been raped or and potentially could be pregnant. This legislation would outlaw Plan B, which can delay ovulation, and another form of emergency contraception, Ella, which can prevent implantation. We need to protect women and support health care for women and men to avoid unwanted pregnancies. Part of my concern was referenced by Ms. Ajola about the need for legislation. If we want to really address unwanted pregnancies, we should talk about birth control, we should talk about sex education, we should talk about access to health care. As was mentioned, this bill would outlaw IVF. It would give status to fertilized eggs. One of my personally biggest fears is the criminalization of miscarriages. One of my friends just had a miscarriage and went to the emergency room. One sentence. I'm concerned that the way this bill is listed, we're going to create a cause of action against women who have miscarriages. 1 in 7 pregnant women have had a miscarriage. I understand understand the motivation for the language, but as it's written, there are too many unintended consequences that affect the rights of men and women to control their fertility. Thank you.
Thank you.